The razor blade catches morning light. Jack Thayer's hands shake as he sits alone in his parked car. September 20th, 1945, Philadelphia. 33 years since that April night when he jumped into freezing Atlantic water and lived. His wrists begin to bleed. The cries from that night still echo in his mind. 1,500 voices calling for help, calling for mothers, calling for God. The 17-year-old who survived by clinging to an overturned lifeboat has carried those sounds every single day. This is how some rescue stories end. But why did surviving America's most famous disaster become a curse for so many? The screams never stopped, not in 33 years. Jack Thayer presses his fingers against his temples, trying to silence voices that died decades ago in the North Atlantic darkness. December 24th, 1894. John Borland Thayer III enters the world as Philadelphia aristocracy. His father, John Thayer Jr., serves as director and second vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. His mother, Marion Longstreth Thayer, navigates Philadelphia's elite social circles with practiced grace. The Thayer mansion in Haverford represents everything American wealth can purchase: security, privilege, and the assumption that tragedy happens to other families. April 10th, 1912. Cherbourg, France. 17-year-old Jack boards RMS Titanic with his parents for their return voyage to New York. He occupies first-class cabin C-70, adjoining his parents' suite C-68. The ship stretches 882 feet in length, rises 175 feet above the waterline, and displaces 52,310 tons of Atlantic water. Her designers claim she can survive flooding in any 4 of her 16 watertight compartments. The mathematics of disaster prove different from the mathematics of engineering. If you're curious about the hidden psychology of survival, subscribe now and tell me where you're watching from. Jack spends 4 days exploring Titanic's unprecedented luxury. The ship contains a gymnasium, swimming pool, Turkish bath, squash court, and libraries stocked with 1,500 volumes. He befriends Milton Long, another wealthy American teenager traveling first class. They discuss their futures over 7-course dinners in the a la carte restaurant, where meals cost extra even for first-class passengers. April 14th, 11:40 p.m. Jack notices his cabin porthole no longer vibrates with engine rhythm. The massive triple expansion engines that have driven Titanic across 1,495 nautical miles have fallen silent. He dresses quickly and steps onto the boat deck, where crewmen are removing canvas covers from lifeboats with an efficiency that suggests practiced emergency procedure. The temperature measures 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The ocean lies mirror-flat, without even slight swells to reflect starlight. 2:05 a.m. The ship's stern begins rising from the water at an impossible angle. Jack finds himself separated from his parents in crowds surging across increasingly tilted decks. His father vanishes into groups of men who understand they face death with dignity. His mother escapes in Lifeboat 4, leaving Jack alone with Milton Long at the ship's rail. The decision comes in seconds. As Titanic's bow disappears and her massive bronze propellers emerge from the ocean, Jack and Milton realize they must choose: die aboard the ship or die in water cold enough to stop a human heart in minutes. Milton jumps, first facing toward the ship. Jack never sees him again. Jack leaps backward, away from the 3 propellers that could crush him instantly. The 28-degree water hits like liquid electricity, stopping his heart for several seconds before it restarts. Somehow, impossibly, he surfaces and swims toward Collapsible B, an overturned lifeboat washing away from the sinking ship. 30 men cling to this capsized boat for 4 hours and 20 minutes. Jack listens as voices in the water grow fewer, then fade to silence. He watches Titanic break apart between her 3rd and 4th funnels, contradicting every naval architect's prediction, and slipped beneath the Atlantic. The sounds from the water, he later writes, reminded him of the high-pitched hum of locusts in the trees back home in Pennsylvania. But these aren't insects. These are human voices experiencing hypothermia's final stages. 8:30 a.m., April 15th. RMS Carpathia rescues Jack from collapsible B and reunites him with his mother. They learn that 1,517 people have died, including Jack's father. Of 2,224 souls aboard Titanic, only 7 to 12 survive. Jack Thayer returns to Philadelphia as a hero. The press celebrates his survival story. He graduates from the University of Pennsylvania, serves as an artillery officer in World War I, marries Lois Buchanan Cassatt, and builds a successful career in banking. The nightmares, however, never end. What transforms a miraculous survival into decades of psychological torment? And why do the sounds of that night prove impossible to silence? Margaret Brown hates being called a hero. Standing on Carpathia's deck, organizing relief for survivors who lost everything, she dismisses praise with characteristic bluntness. Typical Brown luck. We're unsinkable. The press seizes the phrase, transforming Margaret into the unsinkable Molly Brown, a nickname she never uses during her lifetime. Hollywood later creates a musical comedy around her story, starring Debbie Reynolds in a performance that bears little resemblance to reality. The true story proves far more complicated than legend suggests. July 18th, 1867, Hannibal, Missouri. Margaret Tobin enters the world as the daughter of Irish Catholic immigrants. Her father, John Tobin, works at the Hannibal Gas Works for wages barely sufficient to feed 6 children. Her mother, Johanna Collins Tobin, struggles to maintain dignity in a 3-room cottage on Butler Street. At 13, Margaret leaves her aunt's grammar school to work at Garth's tobacco factory, contributing to family survival rather than pursuing education. Margaret follows siblings Daniel and Mary Ann to Leadville, Colorado, a silver mining town promising opportunity for those willing to work in harsh conditions. She finds employment at a dry goods store, sewing carpets and drapes for 12 hours daily. Leadville sits 10,200 feet above sea level, where winter temperatures drop to -40 degrees and summer brings violent thunderstorms. She meets James Joseph Brown, a mining engineer and superintendent, 12 years her senior. Despite his education and management position, JJ earns modest wages in an industry where fortunes appear and disappear with equal speed. If this exploration of truth versus myth interests you, hit subscribe and comment which Titanic legend you'd like examined next. September 1st, 1886. Margaret marries J.J. Brown at Leadville's Annunciation Church. Their early marriage proves difficult. Mining remains unpredictable work, and money stays scarce despite J.J.'s responsibilities. Margaret gives birth to Lawrence Palmer in 1887 and Catherine Ellen in 1889, raising children in a harsh mountain environment. 1893 transforms everything. J.J.'s Ibex Mining Company discovers gold at the Little Johnny mine, generating profits that make the Browns millionaires within months. They purchase a Denver mansion for $30,000, equivalent to $900,000 today, and fill it with furnishings acquired during European travels. Wealth solves Margaret's financial problems, but creates new challenges. Denver's established society views the Browns as nouveau riche outsiders lacking proper breeding. Margaret's growing activism for workers' rights, women's suffrage and judicial reform alienates both social circles and her increasingly conservative husband. JJ holds traditional views about women's roles and disapproves of Margaret's public involvement in controversial causes. After 23 years of marriage, Margaret and JJ sign a separation agreement. She receives $700 monthly allowance, $24,000 in current currency, to continue her travels and political work. They never officially divorce, maintaining respectful correspondence until JJ's death in 1922. Margaret spends 1912's early months touring Egypt, France and Italy with their daughter Helen. While visiting Paris as part of John Jacob Astor Thor's traveling party, she receives news that her eldest grandchild, Lawrence Palmer Brown Jr., has fallen seriously ill in Kansas. She immediately books first-class passage on the earliest available ship departing for New York, RMS Titanic, April 14, 1912. After Titanic strikes the iceberg, Margaret helps load other passengers into lifeboats before crew members force her into Lifeboat 6. The boat launches with only 28 people, despite capacity for 65. Quartermaster Robert Hitchens commands the lifeboat but refuses to return for survivors struggling in the water. Margaret argues with Hitchens for hours, threatening to throw him overboard if he doesn't attempt rescue efforts. She takes charge of rowing, keeps spirits elevated among terrified passengers, and uses her knowledge of multiple languages to comfort foreign survivors. Her actions aboard Lifeboat 6 represent genuine heroism under extreme conditions. Aboard Carpathia, Margaret organizes the Survivors Committee, raises $10,000 for destitute passengers who lost everything, and provides informal counseling for traumatized survivors. By the time they reach New York, she has helped establish systematic relief efforts. The press transforms her into a folk hero. Magazine articles describe her commanding lifeboats, fighting cowardly crew members, and saving lives through personal courage. Much of this proves accurate, but fame brings unexpected consequences. What happens when surviving disaster makes you famous, and fame becomes its own kind of prison? Money can't erase memory, but it can buy the silence that prevents healing. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line and Titanic's owner, escapes the sinking incollapsible sea, the last lifeboat to leave the starboard side. His survival will haunt him for the remaining 25 years of his life. April 15, 1912. As Carpathia steams toward New York with 712 survivors, Ismay retreats to the ship's doctor's cabin and refuses to speak with other passengers. Captain Arthur Rostron orders stewards to bring Ismay meals privately, noting his extreme emotional distress. The man who proclaimed Titanic practically unsinkable now faces the consequences of his hubris. Ismay's survival sparks immediate controversy. American newspapers accuse him of cowardice, claiming he escaped while women and children perished. Senator William Alden Smith, chairman of the Senate inquiry into the disaster, subjects Ismay to brutal questioning designed to establish criminal negligence. Did you in fact urge Captain Smith to increase Titanic's speed through the ice field? Senator Smith demands during testimony. Ismay's careful legal responses satisfy investigators but destroy his public reputation. If you're interested in how public opinion shapes disaster narratives, subscribe and let me know which aspect of the aftermath intrigues you most. The numbers tell their own story. Of 329 first-class passengers aboard Titanic, 199 survive, a 60% survival rate. Of 285 second-class passengers, 119 survive, 42%. Of 709 third-class passengers and crew, only 178 survive, 25%. These statistics reveal uncomfortable truths about who lives and who dies when disaster strikes. Ismay's first-class ticket guarantees him a seat in a lifeboat. His survival represents systematic inequality rather than personal cowardice. But public opinion demands villains to explain. Tragedy. Ismay returns to England facing social ostracism, business boycotts, and death threats. His wife and children endure harassment from strangers who view the family as symbols of capitalist callousness. Ismay resigns from White Star Line's management in 1913, selling his shares and retreating from public life. He purchases a remote estate in County Galway, Ireland, where he spends years fishing, hunting, and avoiding contact with the outside world. His great-grandson Malcolm Cheap later observes, "I suspect he suffered from post-traumatic stress. The whole family suffered without doubt." Ismay's wife and children never discussed Titanic publicly. Family letters reveal the psychological toll of carrying survivor guilt combined with public shame. Ismay dies at age 74, having spent 25 years in self-imposed exile. His role in the disaster remains historically debated. Was he a coward who abandoned his ship, or a businessman caught in circumstances beyond his control? The ambiguity reflects larger questions about responsibility, survival, and the stories societies tell about disaster. What determines who becomes a hero and who becomes a villain when the same event saves and destroys lives simultaneously? 7 men will take their own lives. 3 women will die from stress-related illnesses within 2 years. Dozens of marriages will collapse. The mathematics of survival extend far beyond that April night in 1912. Dr. Washington Dodge, a first-class passenger and prominent San Francisco physician, survives by hiding in a lifeboat. His medical expertise saves lives aboard Carpathia, where he treats survivors for hypothermia, shock, and severe emotional trauma. 7 years after the disaster, Dodge shoots himself in the head at his San Francisco office. Business failures and investment problems contribute to his decision, but friends report he never recovered psychologically from Titanic's sinking. Dr. Henry William Frauenthal, another surviving physician, jumps from his apartment balcony in 1927. His wife's mental illness compounds his own depression that began the night he watched 1,500 people die in freezing water. If you're drawn to understanding the long-term costs of trauma, subscribe now and share what other historical disasters interest you. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first spotted the iceberg, spends decades convinced he could have prevented the entire disaster if the crow's nest had possessed binoculars. Fleet works at sea until 1936, then struggles with poverty and alcoholism in Southampton, England. January 10th, 1965. Fleet hangs himself 2 weeks after his wife's death. He was 24 years old on Titanic and lived 53 more years carrying the weight of those crucial 37 seconds between spotting the iceberg and impact. The statistics reveal a pattern. Of Titanic's approximately 712 survivors, at least 7 commit suicide in subsequent decades, a rate significantly higher than the general population. Many others suffer what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though no such diagnosis existed in 1912. Contemporary medicine offers no treatment for survivor guilt, recurring nightmares, or the persistent sound of screaming voices in the darkness. Charles Lightoller, the most senior crew member to survive, becomes a decorated war hero during World War I and later uses his private yacht to rescue British soldiers from Dunkirk during World War II. His post-Titanic service demonstrates that survival guilt can motivate extraordinary courage or extraordinary self-destruction. The choice often depends on factors beyond individual control. Elizabeth Gladys Dean, known as Milvina, travels aboard Titanic at 9 weeks old, the youngest passenger. Her family emigrates to Kansas seeking better opportunities. After her father dies in the sinking, her mother returns to England with Milvina and her brother. Milvina spends most of her life avoiding publicity about her Titanic connection. She works as a secretary and cartographer, living quietly in Hampshire until her final years. Only as the number of living survivors dwindles does she begin appearing at Titanic conventions and signing autographs. She dies in 2009 at age 97, the last living survivor of history's most famous shipwreck. Her longevity contrasts sharply with survivors who died young from suicide, stress-related illness, or accidents that may have been intentional. What determines which survivors find peace and which ones never escape that night in the North Atlantic? They were called the Titanic Orphans. Two French boys, ages 4 and 2, rescued without parents or guardians. Their true story reveals how disaster creates identity, as well as destroying it. Michel Navratil Jr. and Edmond Navratil board Titanic under false names. Their father, Michel Navratil Sr., has kidnapped them from their estranged wife in France and plans to start a new life in America. He uses the alias Louis Hoffman and calls his sons Lolo and Momon. April 15th, 2:05 a.m. As Titanic's final lifeboat prepares to launch, Michel Sr. wraps his children warmly and places them in collapsible D. He kisses them goodbye and steps back to die with the ship. The boys arrive in New York without identification, unable to communicate in English, clinging to each other in confusion and terror. The press embraces their story. Photographers capture haunting images of two small children in oversized life jackets, their eyes wide with incomprehension. The images appear in newspapers worldwide, generating enormous public sympathy and substantial donations for their care. But who are they? Their father used false documents, leaving no trail to their true identities. If stories about lost identity and found families move you, subscribe, and tell me about other historical mysteries that fascinate you. Margaret Brown and other first-class survivors organize their care aboard Carpathia. The children stay at first-class passengers' expense in New York, while authorities attempt to identify them. Social workers try basic French phrases, hoping to discover their origins. Michael Jr., nearly 4, remembers fragments. A woman with kind hands, a house with flowers, the sound of French lullabies. Edmond, only 2, remembers nothing coherent. Their photographs appear in European newspapers. In France, Marcel Navratil recognizes her missing children and travels immediately to New York. The reunion generates massive press coverage, immigrant mother reclaiming her sons from disaster's aftermath. But the damage proves deeper than separation. Michael Jr. grows up carrying memories of that night. His father's final embrace, the sound of rushing water, the crying of strangers in lifeboats. He becomes a philosophy professor, spending decades analyzing the meaning of survival and loss. In 1996, at age 83, Michael reflects on his experience. "I died at 4. Since then, I have been a fair dodger of life, a gleaner of time." Edmond dies in 1953, having lived a quieter existence away from publicity. Michael survives until 2001, becoming the last male survivor of Titanic. He speaks philosophically about his father's sacrifice. "My father dressed me very warmly and took me in his arms. A stranger did the same for my brother. When I think of it now, I am very moved. They knew they were going to die." The boys' survival represents both salvation and burden. They live, but at the cost of losing their father and carrying trauma that shapes their entire lives. Their story raises questions about the nature of rescue. Is saving a life always a gift, or sometimes a sentence to carry unbearable memories? Some survivors never speak of that. Night again. Their silence spreads through families like a contagion, creating generations who inherit trauma without understanding its source. Eva Hart travels aboard Titanic as a 7-year-old child with her father Benjamin and mother Esther. The family emigrates from England to Canada, seeking opportunities Benjamin's building contracting business cannot provide in London. Ava's mother experiences premonitions about the voyage. Esther Hart refuses to sleep at night during the crossing, convinced that disaster awaits. She allows Eva to sleep only during daylight hours, when she believes the ship travels more safely. April 14th proves her instincts tragically accurate. Benjamin Hart helps load lifeboats and ensures his wife and daughter escape in Lifeboat 14. He remains aboard Titanic and dies with 1,517 other souls. Eva and Esther return to England as widow and fatherless child, their emigration plans destroyed along with their family. The psychological impact proves devastating. Esther Hart never allows Eva to sleep at night again, maintaining her belief that darkness brings catastrophe. Eva develops chronic insomnia that lasts decades, unable to trust the safety of nighttime rest. If you're interested in how trauma passes through generations, subscribe now and share your thoughts on family secrets and their consequences. Eva's mother refuses to discuss Titanic publicly. Newspaper reporters regularly request interviews, but Esther maintains absolute silence about their experience. She forbids Eva from speaking to journalists, teachers, or even close friends about that night. The silence becomes a family rule. Titanic remains unmentionable. Eva grows up carrying memories she cannot share. She remembers her father lifting her into the lifeboat, the sound of the ship's band playing as Titanic sank, the cries of people dying in the water. But speaking these memories violates her mother's prohibition. At age 91, Eva Hart finally begins telling her story publicly. She appears in documentaries, gives interviews, and speaks at Titanic conventions. For 84 years, she has carried these memories in enforced silence. Her first public statement proves remarkably direct. "I saw that ship sink. I never closed my eyes. I didn't sleep at all. I saw it, I heard it, and nobody could possibly forget it." Eva's decision to speak reveals the cost of imposed silence. Families who refuse to discuss trauma pass psychological wounds to children who inherit pain without understanding its origins. She describes her mother's lifelong paranoia about nighttime. Mother never got over it. She was always convinced that something terrible would happen at night. Eva herself never marries, dedicating her life to preserving Titanic's historical record and honoring the 1,517 people who died. She becomes a fierce advocate for accurate historical memory, correcting romantic myths about the disaster. She dies in 1996 at age 91, having spent her final years ensuring that silence would never again obscure the truth about that night. Her story demonstrates how speaking trauma can heal families and how silence perpetuates suffering across generations. What other families carry unspoken histories of that night? And how many children grow up inheriting pain they cannot name or understand? Money purchased first-class tickets, private suites, and priority access to lifeboats, but it couldn't buy peace of mind for the wealthy Americans who survived while their servants died. Colonel Archibald Gracie IV, a prominent American historian and real estate investor, travels aboard Titanic while researching his book about the Civil War. His first-class cabin provides every luxury: private sitting room, bedroom, private bathroom, and access to exclusive dining facilities. Gracie spends Titanic's final hours helping women and children into lifeboats. He works alongside crew members, organizing evacuation procedures and maintaining order among panicking passengers. His actions save multiple lives. As Titanic sinks, Gracie finds himself trapped on the ship's tilting deck. He jumps into the ocean and swims to Collapsible B, the overturned lifeboat where Jack Thayer and 30 other men cling to survival. Gracie's survival comes at enormous physical and psychological cost. The freezing water damages his health permanently. He suffers hypothermia-related complications that weaken his heart and respiratory system. The psychological trauma proves equally severe. Gracie experiences persistent nightmares and survivor guilt that affect his ability to concentrate on his historical research. If you're curious about how privilege fails to protect against trauma, subscribe and let me know what other aspects of class differences interest you. Gracie channels his survival into historical purpose. He spends months interviewing fellow survivors, collecting testimonies, and documenting the disaster's details with scholarly precision. His book, The Truth About the Titanic, becomes one of the most authoritative accounts of the sinking. But the effort exhausts him physically and emotionally. Gracie dies in December 1912, just 8 months after the disaster, from complications related to his exposure in the North Atlantic. His family attributes his death directly to the sinking's physical and psychological toll. Gracie's wealth provided him with first-class accommodations and priority access to lifeboats, but it couldn't protect him from trauma's lasting effects. Isidore and Ida Strauss, owners of Macy's department store and among America's wealthiest couples, choose to die together rather than separate during the evacuation. Ida Strauss refuses to board a lifeboat without her husband, famously declaring, "We have lived together for 40 years. Where you go, I go." Their joint decision to face death together becomes one of Titanic's most celebrated love stories. But it also illustrates how wealth sometimes complicates survival decisions rather than simplifying them. The Strauss family's enormous wealth means nothing in the middle of the North Atlantic. Love and loyalty matter more than bank accounts when facing mortality. Other wealthy survivors struggle with different challenges. They live, but watch their servants, valets, and traveling companions die. The social hierarchies that protected them on land prove meaningless in lifeboats, where space matters more than status. Many wealthy survivors develop complicated relationships with their wealth after Titanic. Some, like Margaret Brown, dedicate their fortunes to philanthropic causes. Others retreat from public life, unable to enjoy privileges that survival has made painful. The disaster reveals uncomfortable truths about American class systems and the random nature of survival. What happens when money can't solve the most important problems someone faces? The numbers reveal a pattern of destruction that extends far beyond that April night. 7 suicides among 712 survivors represents a rate 3 times higher than the general population. Dozens of marriages collapse within 5 years. Hundreds of survivors never board ships again. 1,517 people die during the sinking, but Titanic continues killing for decades afterward. Frederick Fleet spots the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. from the crow's nest, rings the warning bell 3 times, and telephones the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch orders "hard a starboard" and reverses engines, but 37 seconds prove insufficient to avoid collision. Fleet's warning saves hundreds of lives by giving Titanic's crew time to alter course slightly, reducing impact severity. Without his alert, the ship might have struck head-on and sunk in minutes rather than hours. But Fleet carries guilt for the rest of his life, convinced he could have prevented the entire disaster with binoculars that were locked away and unavailable. If you're interested in how split-second decisions create lifelong consequences, subscribe now and comment about other historical moments that changed everything. Fleet works aboard various ships until 1936, then struggles with poverty and unemployment in Southampton, England. His wife dies in December 1964, leaving him alone and destitute. On January 10, 1965, Fleet hangs himself in his garden shed. He was 24 years old during Titanic's maiden voyage and lived 53 additional years carrying responsibility for those 37 crucial seconds. The scale of Fleet's suffering multiplies across hundreds of survivors. Dr. Washington Dodge shoots himself in 1919. Dr. Henry Frauenthal jumps from his apartment in 1927. Jack Thayer slits his wrists and throat in 1945. Each suicide represents decades of psychological pain that 1912 medicine cannot address or treat. Contemporary physicians understand little about trauma's long-term effects. Survivors receive no counseling, therapy, or psychiatric support. They face their nightmares alone, often developing alcoholism, depression, or anxiety disorders without professional intervention. Many survivors never discuss their experiences, even with family members. The silence compounds their isolation and prevents healing through shared experience. Charlotte Collier, a second-class passenger traveling with her husband Harvey and 8-year-old daughter Marjorie, loses Harvey in the sinking. Charlotte and Marjorie survive in lifeboat 14, but Charlotte's health deteriorates rapidly after returning to England. She dies in 1916, just 4 years after the disaster, from what doctors describe as consumption complicated by nervous exhaustion. Charlotte essentially dies of a broken heart, weakened by grief and trauma beyond her physical capacity to bear. Madeline Astor, pregnant widow of John Jacob Astor IV, develops serious heart problems that physicians attribute to the stress of her Titanic experience. She dies at 47, her health broken by trauma sustained at 19. The statistical pattern becomes clear. Titanic survivors face significantly higher rates of suicide, premature death, mental illness, and family breakdown compared to similar populations who didn't experience maritime disaster. The ship kills more people than the 1,517 who died that night. It just takes longer. What transforms a single night of terror into decades of psychological destruction? Charles Lightoller, Titanic's second officer and the most senior crew member to survive, spends the disaster's final hours loading lifeboats and maintaining order among panicking passengers. His professional competence saves dozens of lives. As the ship takes her final plunge, Lightoller gets sucked down by the sinking vessel but survives when a massive boiler explosion blows him back to the surface. He climbs aboard Collapsible B, the overturned lifeboat where Jack Thayer and 30 other men await rescue. Lightoller's survival skills and leadership keep the men alive through 4 hours of freezing darkness. His post-Titanic life demonstrates how heroism during disaster can both save and destroy the hero. Lightoller returns to sea immediately after giving testimony at the British Inquiry. He serves with distinction during World War I, commanding destroyers and earning decorations for courage under fire. His wartime service proves that his Titanic heroism represents genuine character rather than momentary bravery. But Lightoller carries psychological scars that never heal. He suffers recurring nightmares about the sinking and develops an obsession with maritime safety that affects his personal relationships and professional decisions. If you're drawn to stories of heroism's hidden costs, subscribe and tell me about other heroes whose sacrifices came with lasting damage. During World War II, at age 66, Lightoller volunteers his private yacht Sundowner for the Dunkirk evacuation. He personally sails across the English Channel under German bombardment and rescues 127 British soldiers from the beaches. His Dunkirk heroics echo his Titanic actions, placing duty and others' lives above personal safety. But they also suggest a man driven by survival guilt to repeatedly risk his life for others. Lightoller's wife Sylvia observes that he never fully recovered from Titanic's sinking. He speaks little about that night, even to family members, but she notices his persistent insomnia and tendency toward depression during anniversaries of the disaster. His heroism comes at enormous personal cost. The man who saved dozens of lives during Titanic's sinking spends decades unable to save himself from the psychological aftermath. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe represents another example of heroic action, followed by personal struggle. Lowe commands Lifeboat 14 and becomes the only officer to return to the wreck site, searching for survivors in the water. His decision saves several lives, including a Chinese passenger found barely alive among the floating debris. Lowe's courage under extreme conditions demonstrates exceptional character and seamanship, but Lowe's post-Titanic career proves disappointing. He struggles to find steady employment, partly because his association with the disaster makes shipping companies hesitant to hire him. The heroic actions that should enhance his reputation instead become professional liabilities. Lowe dies in relative obscurity in 1944, never achieving the maritime career his Titanic heroism should have guaranteed. The pattern repeats across multiple crew members who displayed extraordinary courage during the disaster. Their heroism saves lives but destroys their own futures through survivor guilt, professional stigma, and psychological trauma. Society celebrates heroes during disasters, but often abandons them afterward when the real work of healing begins. What happens when saving others makes it impossible to save yourself? Childhood ends abruptly at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912. The children who survived Titanic's sinking carry adult memories of death and terror that shape their entire lives. Lorraine Allison, age 2, travels first class with her parents Hudson and Bess Allison, baby brother Trevor, and nursemaid Alice Cleaver. When Titanic strikes the iceberg, confusion separates the family during evacuation procedures. Alice Cleaver escapes in Lifeboat 11 with baby Trevor, but Lorraine and her parents remain aboard the sinking ship. Hudson and Bess refuse to board lifeboats without finding their daughter, choosing to search for her rather than save themselves. All three, Hudson, Bess, and Lorraine, perish in the disaster. Trevor Allison becomes the only member of his family to survive. He grows up as an orphan, raised by relatives who struggle to explain why his parents and sister died while he lived. Trevor's survival story illustrates how rescue can become a burden when it separates children from their families permanently. If stories about childhood trauma and resilience move you, subscribe now and share your thoughts on how disasters affect the youngest survivors. Ruth Becker, age 12, travels second class with her mother Nellie, 2-year-old brother Richard, and baby sister Marion. Her father remains in India on business, planning to join them later in America. Ruth experiences the sinking with remarkable clarity for a 12-year-old. She helps her mother care for younger siblings during evacuation and remembers specific details about lifeboat procedures, rescue operations, and other passengers' behavior. But childhood memory preserves both precious and traumatic details with equal intensity. Ruth grows up remembering the exact sound of Titanic's death throes, metal tearing, bulkheads collapsing, steam escaping from damaged boilers. She also remembers the silence that followed, broken only by cries from people freezing in the water. These memories prove impossible to forget or rationalize away. Ruth's post-Titanic life demonstrates both resilience and lasting damage. She becomes a teacher, marries, and raises children successfully. But she never discusses the disaster publicly until her 70s, when historians locate her and request interviews. Her reluctance to speak suggests psychological protective mechanisms that take decades to overcome. Ruth's first extensive interview, conducted in 1982, reveals how clearly she remembers events from 70 years earlier. Trauma preserves memory with extraordinary precision, creating permanent mental records of experiences most people would prefer to forget. Milvina. Dean, at 9 weeks old, becomes Titanic's youngest passenger. She travels third class with her father Bertram, mother Georgetta, and 2-year-old brother Bertram Jr. The family emigrates from England to Kansas, seeking opportunities Bertram's work as a coal trimmer cannot provide in Southampton. Milvina's age means she retains no conscious memories of the disaster, but her family's experience shapes her entire childhood through stories, trauma responses, and financial struggles created by her father's death. After Bertram Dean dies in the sinking, Georgetta returns to England with Milvina and her brother. They face poverty, social stigma, and the challenge of rebuilding lives destroyed by disaster. Milvina grows up knowing she survived history's most famous shipwreck, but remembering nothing about it. This creates a strange relationship with fame based on experience she cannot personally recall. Only in her final decades does Milvina begin appearing at Titanic conventions and speaking with historians. She becomes the disaster's final living link, carrying responsibility for preserving memories that aren't her own. What burden do children carry when they survive disasters that kill their parents? Lady Lucy Duff Gordon escapes Titanic in Lifeboat 1 with her husband Cosmo and only 10 other people. The boat's capacity allows 40 passengers, but crew members lower it away partially empty during evacuation's chaotic final minutes. Their survival in an underfilled lifeboat creates scandal that follows them for years. British newspapers accuse Cosmo Duff Gordon of bribing crew members to row away from drowning passengers rather than returning to save lives. The allegation proves impossible to completely refute or confirm, creating permanent suspicion about their actions that night. Lucy faces different but equally damaging accusations. Society expects women to display maternal instincts during disasters, comforting other passengers and sacrificing personal comfort for others' welfare. Lucy's survival in relative comfort contradicts these expectations. The press portrays her as selfish, cowardly, and unfeeling, a woman who saved herself while others drowned. If you're interested in how disasters reveal society's double standards about gender roles, subscribe and tell me what other historical examples come to mind. Lucy Duff Gordon operates a successful fashion design business, creating evening wear, tea gowns, lingerie, and movie costumes for wealthy international clientele. Her company, Lucille Latied, employs dozens of seamstresses and maintains showrooms in London, New York, and Paris. After Titanic, British society boycotts her business. Customers cancel orders, society women refuse her designs, and newspapers criticize her company's employment practices. The disaster destroys her reputation and seriously damages her financial success. Lucy writes to a friend in 1915, "According to the way we've been treated by England on our return, we didn't seem to have done the right thing in being saved at all." Her bitter observation reveals how survival guilt combines with social punishment to create lasting psychological damage. Lady Duff Gordon's experience illustrates how disaster exposes different survival expectations for men and women. Men who survive face accusations of cowardice for not dying heroically. Women who survive face accusations of selfishness for not sacrificing themselves maternally. Neither gender escapes social judgment when disaster makes survival a moral issue. Madeline Astor, 19-year-old wife of John Jacob Astor Thor, faces different challenges. Her survival in Lifeboat 4 generates public sympathy rather than criticism. She represents acceptable feminine behavior during crisis. But Madeline's youth and pregnancy make her especially vulnerable to trauma's long-term effects. She returns to New York as one of America's wealthiest widows, inheriting millions from her husband's estate. But wealth cannot protect her from psychological consequences of witnessing mass death while carrying an unborn child. Madeline develops serious heart problems that physicians attribute to the stress of her Titanic experience, combined with pregnancy complications. Her health deteriorates steadily for decades, despite access to the best medical care money can purchase. She remarries twice, seeking stability and companionship to heal emotional wounds from that night. Neither marriage provides lasting happiness or peace. Madeline dies in 1940 at age 47, her health broken by trauma sustained at 19. Her death represents another delayed casualty of the disaster, someone who survived the sinking but not its aftermath. The pattern repeats across multiple female survivors. They face unique social pressures, different survival expectations, and psychological challenges that reflect 1912's rigid gender roles. Society expects women to be either heroes or victims during disasters, but offers little support when they prove to be simply human. Third-class passengers and crew members face different survival challenges than first-class celebrities. Their stories receive less publicity, fewer resources for recovery, and minimal historical attention. Carl Jansson, a Swedish immigrant traveling in third-class steerage, experiences the disaster from below decks where warning systems prove inadequate and escape routes become death traps. Jansson later recalls, "Then I run down to my cabin to bring my other clothes, watch and bag, but only had time to take the watch and coat when water with enormous force came into the cabin and I had to rush up to the deck again." His testimony reveals how class differences affect survival chances. Third-class passengers face locked gates, confusing corridors, and delayed evacuation orders that cost precious time during escape attempts. Of 709 third-class passengers and crew, only 178 survive, a 25% survival rate compared to 60% for first-class passengers. The statistics reflect systematic inequality that follows survivors into their post-disaster lives. If you're interested in how class affects disaster survival and recovery, subscribe now and share your thoughts on social justice and historical memory. Jansson survives by reaching the boat deck, despite physical obstacles designed to separate passenger classes. His testimony helps historians understand how ship design and social hierarchies combine to increase casualty rates among poorer passengers. But Jansson's survival story receives minimal press coverage compared to wealthy survivors like Margaret Brown or Jack Thayer. Working-class survival doesn't generate the same public interest as aristocratic tragedy. This disparity in attention affects recovery resources. Wealthy survivors organize relief committees, hire lawyers, and pursue compensation claims with professional assistance. Working-class survivors often lack these resources and must navigate legal and financial challenges alone. The Titanic Relief Fund, established to assist destitute survivors, distributes aid based on class distinctions that mirror the ship's passenger hierarchy. First-class survivors receive larger settlements than third-class survivors, despite facing arguably less severe financial hardship. John Priest, a fireman working in Titanic's engine rooms, survives the disaster despite being trapped below decks when water floods the boiler rooms. His escape requires extraordinary physical effort and good fortune. Priest's survival makes him somewhat famous. He also survived the sinking of Olympic in 1911 and Britannic in 1916, making him one of only a few men to survive 3 major maritime disasters. But Priest's working-class background means his remarkable survival story receives little historical documentation. We know he existed and survived, but few details about his post-Titanic life remain recorded. This pattern of historical neglect affects most working-class survivors. Their stories matter less to contemporary journalists and future historians, creating gaps in our understanding of how disasters affect different social groups. The absence of their voices from historical records represents another form of inequality. The poor suffer disasters more severely and receive less support for recovery, but also less attention for their experiences. Chinese passengers face additional challenges. 6 Chinese sailors survived the disaster but cannot enter the United States due to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Despite being rescued and brought to New York, immigration officials deport them immediately. Their survival stories remain almost completely unknown for over a century, until researchers piece together fragments of their experiences through shipping records and immigration documents. The erasure of their stories reflects racial as well as class discrimination in disaster memory. What happens when society decides some survival stories matter less than others? The mathematics of disaster extend beyond casualty counts to encompass decades of legal battles, insurance claims, and financial settlements that reveal uncomfortable truths about the value societies place on human lives. $664,000, the final settlement paid by White Star Line in December 1915 to resolve all legal claims arising from the disaster. This amount represents 26% of the claimants committee's estimated total damages of $2.5 million. $500,000 of the settlement goes to American claimants. $50,000 goes to British claimants. $114,000 pays legal expenses and interest charges accumulated during 3 years of litigation. The disparity in payments reflects legal system inequalities that mirror the class distinctions aboard Titanic itself. American passengers and their families hire expensive lawyers and pursue aggressive litigation strategies. British passengers, governed by maritime law that limits shipping company liability, receive far smaller settlements despite comparable losses. If you're curious about how legal systems handle mass disasters, subscribe and comment on other cases where justice seemed unequally distributed. Individual settlements vary dramatically based on passengers' social status and economic circumstances. First-class passengers' families receive substantial awards reflecting their lost earning potential and social position. Third-class passengers' families receive minimal compensation, often less than $1,000 per death. The legal system assigns monetary values to human lives based on class distinctions that determine not only who lives and dies during disasters, but how much their deaths are worth afterward. Margaret Brown receives recognition for organizing relief efforts, but struggles with her own legal battles. Her separated husband, J.J., dies in 1922, creating inheritance disputes between Margaret and their children that last 5 years. The legal conflicts destroy family relationships and consume much of the wealth that J.J.'s mining success had created. Margaret spends her final years in reduced circumstances, unable to enjoy the financial security her Titanic heroism should have provided. Jack. Thayer's family faces different financial pressures. His father's death disrupts the Thayer family's financial planning and creates inheritance complications that affect Jack's educational and career opportunities. The Pennsylvania Railroad provides some financial support for John Thayer Jr.'s widow and children, but the family never recovers the social position and financial security they enjoyed before the disaster. Insurance companies initially deny many claims related to Titanic losses, arguing that passenger belongings and cargo weren't covered under standard maritime policies. These disputes generate additional litigation that can last years and often favor insurance companies over disaster victims. Lloyd's of London, which insured Titanic's hull and machinery, eventually pays White Star Line $1 million for the ship's total loss. But passenger insurance claims face more complicated legal challenges. Many survivors lose personal property worth thousands of dollars, jewelry, clothing, business documents, family heirlooms, that insurance companies refuse to cover fully. The financial impact of these losses compounds the emotional trauma of survival. Crew members' families receive the smallest settlements despite suffering arguably the greatest losses. Titanic's crew came from working-class backgrounds in Southampton, England, where entire neighborhoods lose breadwinners in the disaster. The White Star Line provides minimal compensation to crew families, arguing that maritime employment inherently involves risk that workers accept voluntarily. This legal position ignores the reality that crew members had no choice about working conditions or safety equipment that contributed to their deaths. The pattern of unequal legal treatment reflects broader social inequalities that disasters expose, but legal systems perpetuate rather than correct. How do legal systems decide what different lives are worth? And why do these decisions often mirror the social hierarchies that create disasters in the first place? Passenger lists record 2,224 people aboard Titanic, But the fates of many survivors remain unknown because they returned to countries that didn't track their long-term welfare or preserve their stories for historical record. 8 Chinese passengers board Titanic at Southampton, all crew members from other ships who purchased third-class tickets for transportation to New York. 6 survive the sinking, making them among the disaster's most remarkable survivors, given the extremely low survival rate for third-class passengers. But their survival creates immediate problems rather than relief. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibits Chinese nationals from entering the United States except under specific circumstances. Immigration officials at Ellis Island face an unprecedented legal question: what to do with disaster survivors who lack proper entry documents. The solution reflects America's racial attitudes in 1912. Officials allow the Chinese survivors to land temporarily for medical treatment, then deport them immediately on the first available ships leaving New York Harbor. If you're interested in how immigration policies affect disaster survivors, subscribe now. And tell me what other historical injustices deserve more attention. Their names appear in passenger manifests and survivor lists, but their post-disaster experiences remain almost completely undocumented for over a century. American newspapers ignore their stories. Chinese officials don't track their welfare, and historians overlook their experiences until recent research efforts uncover fragments of their lives. Fang Lang, one of the 6 Chinese survivors, eventually settles in the United States despite initial deportation. He lives quietly in New York's Chinatown for decades, working various jobs and avoiding publicity about his Titanic experience. His survival story only becomes known in 2021 when researchers for the documentary The Six locate surviving family members and piece together his biography through immigration records and family oral histories. The century-long erasure of Chinese survivors' stories reflects broader patterns of racial discrimination that affect disaster memory and historical preservation. Croatian passengers face similar challenges. 37 Croatians board Titanic as third-class passengers, mostly young men and women emigrating to America seeking economic opportunities. Only 3 survive: Mara Osman-Bansky, Ivan Jalševac, and Nikola Lulic. Their survival stories receive minimal documentation in Croatian or American records. They return to lives of agricultural work and small-town existence that generate little historical interest compared to wealthy survivors' experiences. The absence of their voices from historical records represents lost opportunities to understand how disasters affect different cultural groups and immigrant communities. Bulgarian passengers experience complete historical erasure. At least 8 Bulgarians are believed to have perished in the disaster, but insurance company records don't list their names accurately, making it impossible to identify them or track any survivors who might have escaped. A cenotaph near Troyan, Bulgaria, commemorates 8 villagers from Gumoshnik who died, but even their names aren't definitively verified by historical documentation. This pattern of incomplete records affects many international passengers who lacked social connections, wealth, or cultural prominence that ensured historical preservation of their stories. Jewish passengers face additional challenges in historical documentation. At least 69 known Jewish passengers travel aboard Titanic, though the actual number may be much higher due to incomplete passenger manifests and name changes during immigration. Of confirmed Jewish passengers, 39 perish in the disaster. The 30 who survive face both trauma recovery and the challenge of rebuilding lives, often destroyed by emigration plans that the disaster interrupts. Many Jewish survivors change their names after arriving in America, making it difficult for historians to track their long-term experiences or determine how disaster trauma affects their integration into American society. The systematic gaps in historical records reveal how social, Hierarchies determine whose survival stories get preserved and whose experiences disappear from collective memory. What responsibility do historians have to recover these lost voices? And what do their silences tell us about who societies consider worth remembering? Trauma passes through generations like a genetic inheritance, affecting children who weren't born when Titanic sank, but grow up in families shaped by that night's psychological aftermath. Jack Thayer's children develop inexplicable fears of water, ships, and nighttime sounds, despite having no direct knowledge of their father's Titanic experience. His persistent nightmares, insomnia, and anniversary depressions create household atmospheres of unexplained anxiety that affect family dynamics for decades. Edward Thayer, Jack's eldest son, becomes a bomber pilot during World War II, a choice that combines heroism with subconscious self-destruction. When Edward's plane is shot down over the Pacific in 1943, his death triggers the final psychological crisis that leads to Jack's suicide 2 years later. The pattern suggests how survivor guilt can influence parenting decisions and family relationships in ways that put subsequent generations at risk. If stories about inherited trauma and family psychology interest you, subscribe and share your thoughts on how historical events affect families across generations. Margaret Brown's children experience different but equally complicated relationships with their mother's Titanic fame. Lawrence and Helen Brown grow up with a mother who becomes increasingly involved in public causes and international travel, partly as a way to process her survivor experiences. Margaret's post-Titanic activism, women's suffrage, workers' rights, international philanthropy, serves therapeutic purposes for her, but creates emotional distance from her children who need maternal attention rather than heroic inspiration. When J.J. Brown dies, in 1922, legal battles over his inheritance destroy family relationships entirely. Margaret spends 5 years fighting her own children in court over money and property, creating permanent estrangement that lasts until her death in 1932. The wealth that Margaret's Titanic heroism helped preserve ultimately becomes the source of family destruction, when legal conflicts over inheritance replace emotional connections between mother and children. Eva Hart's daughter grows up with a mother who suffers chronic insomnia, refuses to discuss her childhood, and displays irrational fears of nighttime that affect household routines for decades. Eva never explains to her daughter why darkness feels dangerous or why certain sounds, particularly metal creaking or water rushing, trigger panic responses that disrupt family life. The child learns to navigate around her mother's unspoken trauma without understanding its origins, developing her own anxieties about unexplained dangers that could emerge without warning. Only decades later, when Eva finally begins speaking publicly about Titanic, does her daughter understand the source of fears that shaped their entire relationship. This pattern of inherited trauma affects multiple survivor families. Children learn to fear things they cannot name, avoid situations they don't understand, and carry anxiety about disasters that preceded their births. The psychological impact proves particularly severe for children of survivors who never discuss their experiences. Families that maintain silence about trauma pass pain without providing context that would help children process inherited fears. Ruth Becker's children develop similar unexplained anxieties about travel, water, and separation from family members. Ruth's refusal to discuss Titanic until her 70s means her children grow up knowing their mother survived a famous disaster, but never learning how that experience affected her. Parenting decisions. The silence creates mystery rather than protection, leaving children to imagine explanations for their mother's behavioral patterns without having factual information that might reduce rather than increase their anxiety. Children of survivors often describe growing up with persistent sense that disaster could strike without warning, that safety is always temporary, and that family separation represents permanent loss rather than temporary inconvenience. These psychological patterns affect their own parenting decisions, relationship choices, and career paths in ways that extend trauma's impact into third and fourth generations. The recognition of intergenerational trauma as a legitimate psychological phenomenon doesn't emerge until decades after most Titanic survivors have died, meaning families never receive therapeutic support for healing inherited wounds. How many families still carry unrecognized psychological inheritances from that night in 1912? And what does this reveal about disaster's true scope of destruction? As decades pass, the number of living Titanic survivors dwindles, placing increasing psychological pressure on those who remain to serve as historical witnesses for experiences they sometimes wish to forget. Milvina Dean spends most of her 97 years avoiding publicity about her Titanic connection. Born February 2, 1912, she becomes the youngest passenger aboard at 9 weeks old. Too young to form conscious memories of the disaster that kills her father and changes her family's destiny forever. Dean grows up poor in Southampton, England, after her mother Georgetta returns from their aborted emigration to Kansas. Without Bertram Dean's income as a coal trimmer, the family struggles financially while coping with trauma they rarely discuss openly. Milvina works as a secretary and cartographer, living quietly and declining most requests for interviews about her Titanic experience. She possesses no personal memories of the disaster, but carries responsibility for preserving history she cannot personally recall. Only in her final decades, as other survivors die and historical interest intensifies, does Dean begin appearing at Titanic conventions and speaking with researchers. If you're interested in how historical memory passes through individual lives, subscribe now and comment on what responsibilities survivors carry for preserving collective memory. Her decision to finally embrace public attention stems partly from financial necessity. Dean struggles with poverty in her elderly years and begins selling autographs, attending conventions, and participating in documentaries to supplement her small pension. The irony proves painful. The disaster that impoverished her family in 1912 becomes her only source of income in her final years. Dean's public appearances reveal conflicted feelings about her historical role. She appreciates people's interest in preserving Titanic's memory, but resents being defined entirely by an experience she cannot remember and would not have chosen. "I don't really want to be known as the Titanic baby," she observes in one interview. "I'm tired of it." But historical circumstance makes choice irrelevant. As the last survivor, Dean carries collective responsibility for maintaining connection between living memory and historical event. Her death on May 31, 2009, marks a significant transition in how societies remember disasters. With no living survivors remaining, Titanic shifts from personal memory to historical artifact, dependent entirely on secondary sources rather than first-hand testimony. Michael Navratil Jr., the last male survivor, faces similar pressures but responds differently to his historical role. Unlike Dean, Michael retains vivid memories of that night, being lifted into a lifeboat by his father, the sound of rushing water, the confusion of rescue and identification in New York. His survival story possesses dramatic elements that generate public fascination: kidnapped child, heroic father's sacrifice, international reunion with mother, lifelong psychological impact of traumatic rescue. Michel becomes a philosophy professor in France and spends decades analyzing the meaning of survival, loss, and inherited trauma. His intellectual approach to his experience provides therapeutic benefits, but also creates distance from emotional healing. In his 80s, Michel offers philosophical reflection on his survival. "I died at 4. Since then, I have been a fair dodger of life, a gleaner of time. His statement suggests that surviving disaster can feel like cheating fate rather than embracing opportunity, a psychological burden that affects how survivors view their entire lives. Michael's death in 2001 eliminates the last male perspective on disaster that disproportionately killed men and boys. His loss reduces historical testimony to women's voices and infant experiences, potentially skewing understanding of trauma's gender-specific effects. The pressure placed on final survivors to serve as historical witnesses raises ethical questions about society's relationship with trauma survivors. Do communities have the right to demand public service from people who would prefer privacy about their painful experiences? Dean and Michelle both struggle with being reduced to their Titanic identities despite living full lives that encompassed many other experiences and achievements. Their stories suggest that survival can become a prison when societies refuse to allow survivors to be anything other than symbols of historical events they would rather forget. What happens when individual healing conflicts with collective memory? And who decides whether survivors owe their stories to history? 97 years after Milvina Dean's death ends living testimony. Fundamental questions about Titanic's American survivors remain unanswered. Questions that reflect broader uncertainties about how disasters shape individual lives and national memory. Why did 7 survivors commit suicide while others lived to advanced ages without apparent psychological damage? The disparity suggests complex interactions between personal resilience, social support, economic circumstances, and pure chance that researchers still cannot fully explain. Jack Thayer and Frederick Fleet both experienced survivor guilt related to feeling responsible for the disaster's outcome, but their guilt focuses on different aspects. Thayer blames himself for surviving when his father died, while Fleet blames himself for not preventing the collision entirely. These different guilt patterns produce similar self-destructive outcomes, suggesting that the specific content of survivor guilt matters less than its intensity and duration. Margaret Brown and Charles E. Lightoller both channel their survival experiences into heroic post-disaster careers. Brown becomes an activist for women's rights and workers' safety. Lightoller serves with distinction in both world wars and rescues British soldiers from Dunkirk. Their heroic responses suggest that survivor guilt can motivate extraordinary service rather than self-destruction, but factors determining which path survivors follow remain unclear. If you're interested in unresolved questions about trauma and resilience, subscribe now and share your thoughts on what makes some people stronger while others are broken by the same experiences. Class differences affect survival rates during the disaster. 60% of first-class passengers live compared to 25% of third-class passengers. But do class differences also affect long-term psychological recovery rates among survivors? The question proves difficult to answer because historical records preserve more detailed information about wealthy survivors' post-disaster lives than about working-class survivors' experiences. We know that Margaret Brown, Jack Thayer, and other prominent survivors struggled with psychological consequences, but we have limited information about how Carl Jansen, Ruth Becker, and other less famous survivors coped with trauma over time. The absence of working-class voices from historical records might reflect successful adaptation to post-disaster life, or it might reflect systematic neglect of their experiences by journalists and historians more interested in dramatic stories about wealthy survivors. Gender differences create additional analytical challenges. Male survivors face accusations of cowardice for not dying heroically, while female survivors face accusations of selfishness for not sacrificing themselves maternally. These different social pressures produce different psychological stresses that affect recovery in ways that historical records cannot fully Document or compare. Family structure differences also influence survival outcomes in ways that remain poorly understood. Survivors who lose entire families, like the Navratil children, face different challenges than survivors who lose some family members but retain others for emotional support. Jack Thayer retains his mother but loses his father. Margaret Brown maintains her separated relationship with J.J. Brown, but faces family conflicts over inheritance. Eva Hart keeps her mother, but loses her father and struggles with imposed silence about their shared trauma. These different patterns of family loss and preservation create different recovery contexts, but researchers cannot determine which family configurations provide better long-term support for trauma healing. The international dimension adds further complexity. American survivors face different legal, social, and economic circumstances than British, Irish, or European survivors, but comparative studies of national differences in disaster recovery don't exist. Chinese survivors experience racial discrimination that compounds their trauma in ways unique to their cultural position in 1912 America, but their experiences remained largely undocumented. Religious differences might also affect recovery patterns. Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and secular survivors probably develop different frameworks for understanding survival, guilt, and meaning that influence their psychological adaptation over time. But religious affiliations of many survivors aren't clearly documented in historical records, making systematic analysis impossible. The accumulation of unanswered questions reveals how much remains unknown about trauma's long-term effects and the factors that determine who heals and who doesn't after experiencing extreme events. Perhaps the most haunting question involves counterfactual speculation. Would survivors have fared better psychologically if they had received contemporary trauma counseling, psychiatric support, or therapeutic intervention? Or do some disasters create wounds too deep for any medicine to heal? The final count reveals disturbing mathematics. Titanic killed more Americans after the rescue than during the sinking itself. 7 confirmed suicides, dozens of premature deaths from stress-related illness, and countless broken lives suggest that surviving history's most famous maritime disaster became a death sentence with a delayed execution. September 20th, 1945. Jack Thayer's razor blades complete a journey that began 33 years earlier in the North Atlantic darkness. His suicide note, if one existed, has never been found. His family destroys any documents that might explain his decision, preferring silence to revelation. The silence reflects a pattern. American survivors and their families often choose to forget rather than remember, to hide rather than heal, to die quietly rather than live loudly with their pain. But forgetting proves impossible when entire communities carry invisible wounds from a single night of terror. Southampton, England, loses disproportionate numbers of crew members. Entire neighborhoods become widows and orphans overnight. But Southampton acknowledges its losses publicly, builds memorials, and preserves the memories of its dead. American survivors face different pressures. Individual success stories conflict with collective trauma acknowledgement. The American dream demands that people overcome obstacles and achieve prosperity despite setbacks. Admitting that Titanic's psychological damage proves insurmountable conflicts with national narratives about resilience, opportunity, and the power of positive thinking to heal all wounds. If you've been following this exploration of hidden trauma and delayed destruction, subscribe now. And let me know what other historical disasters deserve similar examination of their long-term costs. The scale of ongoing destruction becomes clear only through comprehensive analysis. Margaret Brown's heroic public image masks decades of family conflict and financial struggle. J. Bruce Ismay's wealth cannot protect him from 25 years of self-imposed exile and social disgrace. Even apparently successful survivors like Charles Lightoller carry psychological scars that affect their families, careers, and personal relationships in ways that never receive public acknowledgement. The American survivors who make headlines for their heroism, wealth, or remarkable escape stories represent only the visible portion of a much larger iceberg of destruction that extends beneath historical consciousness. Most survivors disappear from public view within months of the disaster, returning to private lives where their struggles with insomnia, depression, survivor guilt, and relationship problems unfold away from newspaper coverage. Their hidden suffering multiplies across families and communities in ways that prove impossible to measure precisely, but clearly extend Titanic's casualty count far beyond the 1,017 people who died that April night. Modern research into post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor guilt, and intergenerational trauma transmission provides frameworks for understanding psychological patterns that 1912 medicine could neither recognize nor treat. But this understanding comes too late to help the Americans who lived and died carrying Titanic's psychological cargo without support, therapy, or even acknowledgement that their suffering represented legitimate medical conditions rather than personal weakness. The final lesson emerges from recognizing that rescue and recovery are completely different processes. Surviving a disaster does not mean escaping it, and living through tragedy does not guarantee the ability to live well afterward. The Americans who survived Titanic's sinking discovered that the real work of survival begins after the rescue boats reach shore and the press attention fades and the world moves on to other stories. Some found ways to transform their trauma into purpose, service, and meaning. Others never recovered from that night when they listened to 1,500 people die in freezing darkness while they sat in wooden boats, safe but forever changed. Their stories remind us that disaster's true cost cannot be calculated in the immediate aftermath, when rescuers count. Survivors and historians record casualty figures. The full price emerges only across decades, as psychological wounds either heal or fester, as families either rebuild or collapse, as individuals either find peace or surrender to the voices that never stop calling from the darkness. Jack Thayer's final act completes a circle that began when he jumped from Titanic's deck into water that should have killed him instantly. He survived the impossible, only to discover that some fates prove inescapable, no matter how many years pass between the sentence and its execution. The razor blade in his hand represents the weight of 33 years spent carrying sounds that never fade, memories that never heal, and guilt that never forgives. His death closes the door on questions that will never receive answers, and silence voices that demanded more than any human could give. Today they rest together in the Atlantic depths, those who died that night and those who died. Afterward, united finally in the peace that proved impossible to find among the living.